Hello, this is part two of our class 3 discussion on ethics and diversity, and we're going to spend our time now on the topic of diversity. Here are the learning objectives again, but I am going to just jump past those because we've reviewed those already. Let's start with a definition of diversity. Diversity is differences among people due to age, gender, race, ethnicity, national origin, religion, sexual orientation, socioeconomic background, education experience, physical appearance, capabilities, disabilities, and any other characteristic used to distinguish people. So I do want to point out that if you are in HR or if you are in management, and by HR I mean human resource management, or if you are in management, there are some aspects of diversity that are tied to legal compliance, right? I mean, and some that are maybe less so. Certainly, some things like capabilities and education and experience are not really regulated by law, so that you are not supposed to discriminate against people because of those differences. But I think it's important to discuss diversity in a broad sense. So why does it matter? Well, it matters because workforces represent constituents from a variety of diverse populations. And as a manager, you have to know what that is all about. You have to have some appreciation and understanding of different people. You also have customers who are the same way. You have customers that represent different religions and genders and races and national orientations and everything else. And as a consequence, you need to have understanding in order to be most effective with your customers. And the same, of course, would be true for your interactions with your suppliers. What are the sources of diversity in the workplace? Well, this is just a graphic that illustrates some of the things that we've talked about. National origin is not on there. It probably should be. I could argue that regional, what region of the country you grew up in, can also, in the U.S., can influence some of your perspectives about things, and that can be an important difference as well. Why is it such an issue in the U.S., and is it more of an issue now possibly than it has been in the past? It's entirely possible. One is a very aging population. As you know, the baby boomers are getting on up there in age. So the midpoint of the baby boom generation is now over 60. So as that population continues to age and move into the 70s and 80s, we will have a very old population in this country. It's also the case that a lot of people are healthier, and therefore they may work longer than people in previous generations, and you may well have more and more employees who are in that 60, 70, and even 80-year-old age group. And if you're younger, you need to have an appreciation of how to work with older people. If you're older, you certainly have to have an appreciation how to work with younger people. As you know, there's a tremendous amount of emphasis these days placed on understanding millennials. The way people talk about millennials, it's just really extraordinary. And as somebody who's in academics and education, I don't have some of these reservations about millennials that some people in industry seem to have. I think it in some ways reflects the age-old tradition of referring to younger people as, quote, kids today, and how kids today are always different. And that's always been true throughout history, that as people age, they have that perception about younger people. So, but it's out there, and dealing with that bias is something that is important. There's also increasing racial and ethnic diversity to some degree in the United States, but certainly as companies participate globally, as we see new emerging markets in East Asia, as we see new emerging markets in Africa and in South America, we will see in our business interactions increasing racial and ethnic diversity. Women represent over 44% of the workforce. I don't think that's a particularly dramatic number. They were over 30% of the workforce, 70 years ago. So there's been an increase in the percentage of women in the workforce and as a percentage of the workforce, but it has not been a dramatic difference in terms of workforce participation. What is more of an impact is that women are more likely to be in professions than they ever have before. They're more likely to move up into leadership roles in organizations than they ever have before. There are increasing wage disparities out there. It is the case that, and we'll talk about this in a later class, as the knowledge economy has grown in the world, not just in the U.S., but in the world, it is the case that we now tend to have people who are in knowledge-based jobs, and we have people that are in service jobs. Knowledge-based jobs pay well. Service jobs generally don't. And as a consequence, the way work has divided up as things have become more automated and information technology has been more prevalent, and there's more automation in factories and everything else, it has resulted in a striation of the types of jobs that are available, and that tends to group into higher wage and lower wage occupations at this point. All of these things can be resolved with price. I don't want to talk too much like an economist, but ask your economics professors about some of those things. There are more single parent families now than ever before. That has meaning. It has meaning for employees, because employees, if they have children, there may not be another parent there to help out when something goes wrong. And there are more people living alone. It's record-breaking numbers of people who live alone. And again, that has implications for if something goes wrong, whether they're able to handle it on their own, and it also has implications to some degree for what people expect and seek from their employment. So let's talk about how societies and regions and nations differ. So ideas about what a society believes to be good, desirable, and beautiful can differ from region to region, nation to nation, and some of the values that they have in different regions of the world, here and different regions of the world, provide the underpinnings for notions of individual freedom, democracy, truth, justice, honesty, loyalty, social obligation, collective responsibility. All of those things and those beliefs and those values are brought to the job and influence culture, as we've talked about. And those diverse views of things are something that managers must address, and they can be very slow to change. So, international culture. Let's talk a bit about international culture. Norms, what we think of as norms, are unwritten informal codes of conduct that basically tell people how they should act in particular situations and are considered important by most members of a group or organization. So an example might be that in some parts of the world, it's expected when you enter a room that you smile, you move forward, you introduce yourself. And in other parts of the world, it might be more common when you enter the room for you to stand and wait to be introduced. And that's just kind of a norm of behavior. Mores are norms that are considered to be central to the functioning of society and to social life, and folkways are routine social conventions of everyday life. A folkway might be, sort of what everybody has for breakfast, what everybody, what people talk about when they get together, that kind of thing. Hofstede's model of national culture is extraordinary. It is really an excellent model for thinking about culture. And again, it can be used to as a framework for thinking about how an organization might move into another marketplace, might move into another region of the world with its production or its sales efforts. But it also ties to the belief systems that people from different nations bring when they immigrate here. And so it helps to understand the culture someone came from in order to understand their frame of reference and how they think about things. Well, Hofstede has divided the idea of culture into, and this is of national culture, into 5 categories: individualism versus collectivism, low power distance versus high power distance, achievement orientation versus a nurturing orientation, low uncertainty avoidance versus high uncertainty avoidance, and short-term orientation versus long-term orientation. And what he argues is every national culture can be described in terms of these 5 dimensions. And again, we're not saying that people either are an individualist or a collectivist. They fall along a spectrum. They can be halfway between low power distance and high power distance. So again, just as with personality, it's not an either or. It's a continuum of options along a path. So let's take each one. Individualism. That's a worldview that values individual freedom and self-expression and adherence to the principle that people should be judged by their individual achievements rather than by their social background. Now, this is, in the U.S., as you know, one of our dominant values in the U.S. And so obviously the U.S. would be sort of at an extreme in terms of our scores on that dimension of individualism versus collectivism. Collectivism, then, is a worldview that values subordination of the individual to the goals of the group and adherence to the principle that people should be judged by their contribution to the group. Now, one thing that people need to understand is collectivism does not therefore mean communism. So go ahead and shake that perception that may be creeping into your mind about now, because collectivism doesn't really mean that everybody is subordinate to the government. It means that they're subordinate to the group they align with, the group they associate with. And that group could be, their family and community. So we want to make sure we recognize what collectivism means within the context of this model. And it is not necessarily a government that it's referencing. This next dimension is the power distance dimension. It expresses the degree to which the less powerful members of a society accept and expect that power is going to be distributed unequally. In essence, it's acceptance of a form of class system, even if it's not codified as a formal class system. So the basic issue here is, how do societies handle inequities and inequalities among people? So people in societies that have a large degree of power distance, meaning think of it as class, the upper class and the lower class are very far apart, and that's accepted as a hierarchical order. Everybody has a place, and it doesn't need to be explained or justified. That's a large degree of power distance, a high power distance nation. Think of India as a place where that has been true, more so in the past than now, but it's still a good example. Societies with low power distance, in that kind of society, people strive to equalize the distribution of power, and they just don't believe in that idea of differences in class or power, and they rail against it. They push back against it and demand justification for those inequalities. Next, we have the achievement versus nurturing orientation. So the achievement orientation is a worldview that values assertiveness, performance, success, and competition. That competition is good. A nurturing orientation, that is, if that's more dominant in a national culture than competition, then that's a worldview that values sort of quality of life and concern about society in a more general sense. Now, back in the old days, when this model was first proposed, the achievement orientation was described as a masculine orientation, and the nurturing orientation was viewed as more of a women. It was about women and femininity, and a female orientation. And they've now decided that that's not really the right way to describe this, that it doesn't really embody just different generalized differences like that, but that achievement versus nurturing is the dominant view. And if you decide after this class or even as part of this class to read more widely on the Hofstede model, there are some very, very interesting treatments and descriptions of different nations based on these kinds of dimensions. Then there is uncertainty avoidance. Uncertainty avoidance is the degree to which societies are willing to tolerate uncertainty and risk. And the real fundamental issue here is how society deals with the fact that the future can never be known. Should we try to control the future or just let it happen? So companies that exhibit strong, high level of uncertainty avoidance tend to maintain rigid codes of belief and behavior and are very intolerant of unorthodox behaviors and ideas. So it's got to be very controlled. Everyone has to behave exactly alike according to the standard of behavior. Weak uncertainty avoidance societies maintain a much more relaxed attitude and in which practice counts more than these principles. So it's not a rigid society. So some theocracies, I would argue, that are governed by a very, very strict set of religious beliefs would be an example of a high uncertainty avoidance nation. The final dimension is the long-term versus short-term orientation. And long-term orientation is a worldview that values thrift and persistence in achieving goals. You're giving up now for an investment basically in the long-range future. The short-term orientation is a worldview that values stability and happiness and sort of living for the present with the idea that whatever happens in the long run, you'll figure that out later. So that's the difference between the short run and long run orientation. So Hofstede's model of national culture, management practices that are effective in one country might be troublesome in another. That's clearly what this says. Sort of competitive practices that would seem to be completely okay in the United States might not be okay in another country, right? Managers must be sensitive to the value systems and norms of an individual's country and behave accordingly. And then it is also, I think, useful to be mindful of, if you hire somebody from another country and they come here as an immigrant, they will have aspects of that former culture with them. Now, that's not something that won't ultimately, modify itself over time. It's a belief system they had that they may have brought with them, but it is something to just be mindful of. So that concludes our discussion of ethics and diversity. I want to refer you to your textbook chapter for a lot of the issues about diversity as it applies to hiring and diversity as it applies to, there's a lot of discussion about sexual harassment and a lot of discussion about forms of discrimination and things like that relate to trying to maintain a diverse workforce in the United States and not create difficulties for people. But that's well covered in your book, and my objective was to augment the discussion of diversity with this about national culture at this point in time. So I hope that you would be able to understand different stakeholder groups and their ethical stakes. I hope you would be able to apply the rules for ethical decision making in order to sort of sort out and further analyze an ethical dilemma. I would like for you to be able to discuss diversity in the workforce across the entire spectrum of diversity characteristics in the workforce, and then also explain this Hofstede model and its dimensions of national culture and why it matters. Okay, thank you very much.